delighted to be able to speak to you, and particularly Floyd, to see you again. I suspect we've both changed quite a bit since 2017. I notice you've grown a beard, and I've aged somewhat. But I think the debates on basic income since that time have taken off in very exciting ways. I've been advising on pilots and participating in basic income pilots, believe it or not, in 4 continents. And I never expected that to be the case. There are now over 100 basic income experiments going on around the world. We have networks in over 30 countries. We have politicians now, instead of being rude about basic income, they're asking questions that are more useful. And we have a major global economic crisis, which is giving basic income a centrality that not even I would have expected. Believe it or not, I've just been asked by the Palestinians to devise a plan for an emergency basic income in the occupied West Bank and eventually for Gaza if a 2-state solution emerges. And I prepared a paper and delivered it in Ramallah last month. And we also have a program for introducing a pilot basic income in Ukraine as part of a rebuilding process should there be peace at any time. So that is a bit of background context, but let me come to the subject of the talk. I have tried systematically in a number of books, including the latest one, which is called The Politics of Time, to link up the commons with basic income. And I think it's very important to reflect on what we mean by the commons. The beginnings of it go back to the ancient Rome, when the Justinian Codex, which is the basis of common law throughout the world today, went forward into the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest in 1217, which established a right of subsistence in the commons. And the Justinian Codex said there are 4 types of property. There is private property, state property, nobody's property, and common property. And common property includes the land, the minerals, the sea, the seabed, the air, and it includes the social commons, what we inherit that has been bequeathed to us as our institutional structures. They belong to all of us, and we belong to nature and to the commons. It's an ecological concept, which is very important in the 21st century. And the commons are something that are associated with commoning, the ability to do activities together, sharing and cooperatively, and linked to reproduction rather than production and depletion of resources. So the commons is a concept which goes back through our history. And of course, in every part of the world, the commons has been taken away from us as commoners through enclosure, through privatization, through commodification, through neglect, and through pure theft. And nowhere more so is that the case than in what I've called the Blue Commons. I wrote a book several years ago called The Blue Commons, which is about the sea and everything in the sea, which is part of our global commons. Yet it's been privatized, it's being exploited, It's being taken illegitimately, and we have every right to demand that common dividends should be paid to everybody. It's common wealth, as you put it, and I put it in the books. And that is, I think, a very important way. It doesn't say that private property is illegitimate. No, it says that there are different types of property. Even John Locke, the theorist of private property rights, recognized the legitimacy and the primacy of the commons. So I think it's perfectly compatible with a market economy and with various forms of capitalism, if you like. It's not something that is a denial of a market system, as some people purport to claim. Now that commons goes with something that I've been analyzing, particularly in the new book, The Politics of Time, goes back to ancient Greece, where they had a very brilliant conceptualization of time. And time was divided between 5 types of uses.
Yes, the scary cleaning lady's gone.
Sorry, Mr. Stanning is muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, you can hear me now. Okay, well, I don't know where I was cut off, but essentially going back to ancient Greece, they had a much richer conceptualization of time uses than the modern neoliberal framework. Basically, they said there's labor. Labor is done by the slaves, the metics. It's unfree activity. It's done for exchange value. And it's differentiated from work. Work was done among relatives, among friends, around the home, and it has use value. And besides labor and work, there was recreation, which was designed to facilitate bodily and mental health, and there was leisure. And leisure was called scholle, and it was essentially public participation in the life of the polis. It combined education with political activity. And in addition, Aristotle in particular valued urgia, contemplation, time doing nothing, which the Romans subsequently took forward and Seneca took forward. And Cato said memorably, never is a man more active than when he's doing nothing. We need urgia, but the modern utilitarian dismisses urgia as idleness, as slothfulness, as something to be condemned. But it's vital to appreciate that humanity wants to do work, not labor, wants leisure, not just consumption, and needs urgia, needs space. But the modern capitalist system condemns work that is not labor. It squeezes out scholle, and it denigrates laziness. We have a system where the precariat, about which I've written several books, the precariat face a loss of control of time. They have to do a lot of work for labor. They have to do work for the state. They have to do work for charity. They have to do work for reproduction. They've lost control of time and suffer from a precariatized mind through loss of control of time. And of course, the precariat have lost access to the commons. Everywhere where in the past, the low-income people relied on the commons for their subsistence, for their social protection, for their society. But that's been taken away. So we have a situation where time has been reshaped by modern capitalism to the detriment of having control and the detriment of inequality of time. And we have a loss of the commons. And here we come to why basic income is morally and ethically justifiable. Because first and foremost, a basic income is a matter of common justice. If you allow private inheritance of private wealth, why shouldn't we allow the public inheritance of public wealth, common wealth? And in that regard, paying everybody an equal common dividend, a dividend on the common value of common wealth, is a matter of justice. It's a matter of saying that everybody has an equal right. It's not something that should be means tested or behavior tested. It belongs to all of us. Because the income and wealth of all of us, every single one of us, is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of the many, many generations before us than anything we do ourselves. Even prominent people like Warren Buffett and prominent Nobel Prize-winning economists have accepted that. And that, I think, is the first and foremost justification for a basic income as a common dividend. If you're religious, I'm not religious, but I'm very pleased that the Pope has come round to supporting basic income, and he recognizes that God gives humanity, individuals, different talents. Many people don't have the talent to make money or be successful or have the energies or the abilities or whatever you want or the luck. And a basic income is a sort of compensation to those who don't have the talents or luck. I can accept that. It's also a matter of ecological justice. Depriving us of the commons benefits the wealthy. The wealthy are the cause, the major cause of pollution and global warming and depletion of the species. The low-income people are those who suffer from bad air, bad water, loss of the commons, loss of space. And therefore, you could say it's a matter of ecological justice that those who've gained from depleting our commons should compensate those who are badly affected by the loss of the commons. For me, basic income is mainly based on a demand for common justice. But it's also a matter of enhancing freedom. Every politician say they believe in freedom. Everybody says they believe in freedom. But you can't be free if you lack the material resources to be able to make rational decisions. So there are three types of freedom. The first freedom is what I would call the libertarian freedom. The freedom to say no to an exploitative landlord, employer, or an oppressive relation, a spouse. We have found with our basic income pilots that many women use that to walk out of abusive relationships. They have the power to say no. How important is that? It's also a matter of liberal freedom. Liberal freedom is the freedom to be moral, the freedom to decide that I'm doing this because I believe it's the right thing to do. If you are part of the precariat, you have to do whatever you need to do to survive. So you can't be moral. You have to be opportunistic. to enhance the ability of all of us to be altruistic, to be rational, is fundamentally important. And it's part of gaining control of time. And the third freedom is Republican freedom. The freedom to be free of the will of the other. A woman is not free, for example, if she has to ask her husband or partner or father or whatever if she can do something, even if she knows that 99% of the time he will say yes. A woman is only free if she can decide for herself. And that's the case for any of us. It's a form of freedom that is precious and ignored in our conventional politics. And the third moral and ethical reason for a basic income and to move in the direction of a basic income is that it would enhance basic security. Basic security is a human need. We all want basic security. Basic security is not total security, which leads to carelessness and so on, but basic security is essential. The psychologists have shown us that people who are insecure experience a diminishing mental bandwidth, a diminishing capacity to be rational, a diminishing capacity to be altruistic and tolerant, and therefore tend to go towards populist extremism. Basic security improves people's mental capacities. And you cannot honestly expect people to be making optimal decisions if they're chronically insecure, because that insecurity adversely affects their capacity to be rational. That's important. So basic security is something that will come from basic income. And I want to conclude by talking about some of the results of the pilots. And I think the pilots are incredibly important for dealing with what I call low-hanging fruit. Among the low-hanging fruit claims by the critics is that if everybody had a basic income, even a modest amount, they would become lazy. They would stop work. Well, I must tell people who claim that the pilots have shown the opposite. People who have a basic income have more energy, more confidence, take more entrepreneurial risks, and work more, not less. They also escape from poverty traps and what I call precariat traps, and they actually become more productive in the work that they do. But pilots have also shown, particularly in developing countries, that it leads to improvements in nutrition, improvements in mental and physical health, improvements in the taking of medicines through to completion, which is so important. It shows, many of the pilots have shown, that it leads to an increase in schooling attendance and schooling achievements, including a wonderful pilot that I call the accidental pilot in North Carolina, where a long-term effect was that those who'd been receiving a basic income over 16 years from the time they were born were 1 year ahead on average than those who had not been receiving the basic income. A remarkable fact. It's also shown that people who've received a basic income have emancipated themselves. In many cases, this has been beneficial for women. A major pilot we did in India with thousands of people receiving, kind of men, women, and children, with the basic income paid of the children paid to the mother or the surrogate mother. At the end, we asked, who do you think benefited most from the basic income. And both men and women, the vast majority, said women. It gave women a sense of control, a sense of security, and the emancipatory value was greater than the money value. And part of the reason for that is that if a whole community is receiving a basic income, it's a commons. It induces social solidarity. It induces a reduction of petty crime. It induces confidence to plant vegetables and breed animals for fear, without fear of losing them for petty theft. Things like that. It induces a cooperative spirit that we've seen in Africa, we've seen in India, we've seen in Latin America. But also we see it in experiments in cities in the United States. And I've seen it recently in pilots in Barcelona and in Wales. So what we're seeing, I think, is most significantly that it gives security, even if it's moving in that direction and is not giving as much security as we would like. It is moving in a direction that is fundamentally opposite from how the state has gone in the last 30 years. The state has moved welfare to conditionality, to pure punishments, to means testing, to behavior testing, to arbitrary unfairness and poverty traps, and demonizing those on the lower rungs of our society. I have found myself experiencing something I never anticipated. When I wrote the book, The Precariat, in 2011, I had no expectation that it would change my life as well as be affecting literally millions of people. Since then, that book has been translated into 24 languages, and I've been invited to give talks on the Precariat in over 700 places in over 40 countries. Every day I hear from someone somewhere, maybe Canada, maybe Japan, maybe South Africa, maybe Brazil, telling me, your book is about me. Because we in the Precariat are being ignored. We are supplicants. We are losing social rights. We are losing citizenship rights. And increasingly, we're having to turn to extremists because they're the only ones who are addressing our needs and insecurities. That is where we stand today. Donald Trump and European equivalents like Orban and Marine Le Pen and so on play on the fears of the Precariat, and they're gaining ground because we do not have an emancipatory social policy to give the Precariat security, freedom, and a sense of justice in the state. A basic income by itself will not solve all our problems, but it is a necessary policy. It is something that we are determined to see implemented in our lifetime. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Standing. Amazing, amazing talk. We are near the end of the hour, but as is common in these calls, we just go as long as people want to stay and we have questions. And I believe you probably have more time since you thought this was starting at 1:30. So I'll do a bit of a talk with you, a fireside Q&A, and then we'll go into audience questions. And the audience, you can add your questions to Slido. And yeah, so I guess we'll begin. As I read your books over the years and even this talk, I'm just noticing that there's two very major reforms that are kind of intertwined. Like one is the idea of a basic income and all the benefits it has, which you've mentioned. And the other is the idea of creating, of restoring the commons, of sharing in the value of the commons, of creating common wealth that we all share together. And it seems that the latter reform is almost a bigger idea for reform than the basic income itself. And I've run into a lot of difficulty over the last few years of how to balance that and how to talk to politicians who are grounded in the now, in the next, in anti-poverty, to talk about the wider ideas of land rent reform and such. I'm curious, like, how have you managed to be so effective pushing basic income, but yet, like, how do you balance these two? In some ways, can be almost non-complementary, because like when I start talking about the commons and rents, it confuses people. Sometimes it takes away from, wait, we just need a basic income now. And just before I stop, I just want to catch you up on what's happening in this country, which kind of underscores the dilemma, which is we seem to be moving towards having a number of targeted mini basic incomes, which are not really basic income by definition, but we have the Canada Child Benefit, where at the lowest incomes people receive up to $600 per child. We have very recently a Canada Housing Benefit, where renters can get up to $700 in unconditional cash. We have piecemeal pieces of targeted cash transfer programs that maybe in 5 years or 10 years might add up to an actual guaranteed basic income amount, so something substantial if it continues at this pace. So there seems to be a growing consensus that existing social programs should be basic income like, and that they remove more and more of the conditions. That seems to be where we're going, and many people in Parliament are for a guaranteed basic income. So I feel it's almost difficult to interrupt that thought process, given all the progress we're making towards reducing poverty through a guaranteed basic income. I wonder if you would comment on that and any advice you have for Canadians in terms of what's next and how to manage this dilemma.
Well, I think, Floyd, that's a very good question, but I think we go back to the Commons Capital Fund proposal. A Commons Fund is based on a principle of universalism, in the sense that we're all commoners, and it includes the revenue from exhaustible common resources. I advocate a variant of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Norwegian Pension Fund, which is based on retaining the royalties of oil and gas from the North Sea that belonged to the Norwegians. And that fund has been built up where the companies have got their profits from making it, but the royalties have all gone into the fund. The fund has been preserved because it is a commons fund and built up, and now it's one of the biggest wealth funds in the world, if not outside China. And it has the capacity to pay out every Norwegian citizen a very healthy basic income. I believe in a commons capital fund, which would take a ground rent, if you like, from all forms of commons that are used. That's why I think a carbon levy has been experimenting in Canada. It has to be recycled to make it politically acceptable, because a carbon levy is essential if we're going to tackle fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions. We are not going to stop the global warming process unless we penalize those who are depleting our air commons. But the trouble with a carbon levy is that it is regressive by itself. In other words, it represents a higher proportion of the income of a low-income person than it would of a wealthy person, even though the wealthy person consumes more and is creating more greenhouse gas emissions. But the only way to do it is to guarantee that the revenue from the levy is recycled as an equal basic income, a part of the basic income, because then it is progressive. And then it becomes politically much more acceptable. Now, we don't have in many countries a proper carbon levy yet. The highest is in Sweden, but it's still not very high. Singapore has quite a good one. But I think we've got to move in that direction. Similarly, a land value tax that you were discussing earlier before I came on. I mean, a land value tax is an obvious form of saying, look, big landowners have benefited from taking or being given or inheriting vast amounts of land. They haven't done anything to deserve that. But those who've got a larger proportion of the land are benefiting. That's the biggest source of property price inflation. Land values have gone up. So a land value tax, again, should go into the Commons Fund and be a source for paying out. And what I've suggested in my books, particularly in the Blue Commons and in the Plunder of the Commons and in Politics of Time, is that we need an eco-fiscal policy strategy now. An eco-fiscal strategy in which we get main tax revenue comes from taxing those who are either depleting our commons or benefiting from our commons. And I think that eco-fiscal strategy would help with global warming, it would help with respect for the environment, and it would provide the capacity to pay out everybody a decent basic income over time. For me, it all comes together. It comes together as a matter of justice, freedom, enhancing quality of life, a good society, and control of time. That is where we should be going.
So would you be happy if a country passed a guaranteed basic income funded through progressive taxation with no discussion of the commons? Like, would that be satisfying enough?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't, because I don't think that the social democratic arsenal of progressive income tax and consumption tax that was successful after the Second World War for several decades, now in a globalized system doesn't work. Let's be honest, it doesn't work. If you impose a high marginal income tax, for example, which I might favor, you might favor philosophically, then what it will do, it will lead to more tax evasion, tax avoidance, and parking more and more of people's, the wealthy's income offshore. That's what it's done. We cannot expect to get the revenue we might like from a progressive income tax. Similarly with consumption tax, these are avoidable. But if we tax what we want people to consume less of, and tax which they have no right to be receiving, then you get political support inbuilt to that process. If you pollute the air, I don't think many people are going to say it would be wrong to tax you. They would say, yeah, well, stop polluting the air. The same with polluting our water or taking our water. Why should private equity, for example, own our water supply, which is the case in Britain and a number of other countries? Why should they? So you say to people, okay, we're going to put a tax on profits from water, which will go in the fund and be distributed to everybody as part of the basic income. Many people will get it. Yeah, why should they make profit from our water? The same with the sea. We're having major debates now about private property rights in fish populations, quotas. Why should a big corporation have ownership of our mackerel or our salmon? It's not theirs. So I think we can justify an eco-fiscal strategy and a commons fund far more easily that people can understand. And then say, yes, but it only works if you recycle the revenue to people. And then you have to have respect for the intergenerational equity principle that I've discussed in the book, because you have to retain the capital value of the commons and only distribute, recycle in basic income, the dividends on the wealth. And that means you have to treat the commons only and only redistribute the profits made from sustainable ecological investments by the capital fund. Anybody who wants to follow that up can read my books on that. But it's an ethical policy. It's a policy that gives promise of a good society. We need control of our time. The precariat are stressed out of their mind because they have no control of their time. It causes death of despair. It causes suicide. It causes the precariatized mind. We have a major crisis of mental ill health, and this comes from chronic insecurity. But all of this can be addressed by eco-fiscal strategy, a commons capital fund, common dividends, and building a greater sense of universalism and solidarity, so we can spend more time in real education. Education for our morality, education for our citizenship, rather than education for human capital. Make more money, make more money. Instead of that, we need education for civilization, for our values. It's the same with our politics. The trouble is that most people in the precariat don't have the time to learn about political issues, so they just have to listen to a populist who comes with simplistic things, and they don't have time. If you don't have time, you listen to who is credible using the better voices, etc., etc. We need to free up time so we can be political again. And I think this all comes together.
It does. I just find it so difficult to like when the politicians want to hear about basic income, to talk about these other concepts. It's very difficult. Like just for instance, we have a success in Canada with the carbon tax and rebates. It was sold in a way that would not harm households because they get the rebate back. And it's recently up for a big political debate. The next election might be about the carbon tax, with the Conservatives being against it and the Liberals and NDP being for it. And the one saving grace it has is that the party can say, the leadership can say, most Canadians are better off because they're getting the rebates. A challenge if they had put that money into a capital fund is that the rebate would not have been big enough, and they could not make that claim. Yeah. So
not
how
immediately, but once the fund builds up, you've got to remember the principle of intergenerational equity. You cannot sort of dissipate the benefits of the commons to today's generation and impoverish the next generation and the generation after that. The commons belongs to everybody intergenerationally as well. And that is why building a commons capital fund is a matter of intergenerational equity as well as giving security. And I think that that is one of the lessons from the privatization of oil, for example, where the benefits can be dissipated to the wealthy of one generation. But in the process, you've lost your commons. And the beneficiaries have been just a few people living today. It's got to be a principled approach. And that's why a fund-based system meets that criterion.
Yeah, not only that, I mean, part of my attraction to all this was, how do we get to a Star Trek future and not a Star Wars future? And I just don't see how we ever avoid the mercantilism and the war and the resource competition of a Star Wars future if we're not sharing in the value of the commons. It will never escape this trap we're in. And a lot of sci-fi has actually also explored what happens if you have a guaranteed basic income, is that it ends up being like in The Expanse, where we've squeezed a meager amount from the wealthy, just enough to like avoid catastrophe, but still you have masses in close to poverty while everyone else lives in sky ships and in clouds and keeps all their wealth. So I do see that a fund, a commonwealth approach of sharing an asset that we all own together is key for humanity's long-term evolution. It's just so difficult to talk about that to people today, given today's challenges.
Well, Lloyd, up to that last remark, I was nodding, totally agreeing with you. But what I found is actually that once you do explain it to people in the precariat in particular, they get it pretty quickly. They get it, okay? And they often will ask, why is this not being mainstreamed and being taken up by mainstream politicians? And I'm beginning to say that I think the younger generation who are coming through, who are part of the precariat, who are studying these issues, are beginning to articulate something close to what we're talking about. And there's an energy out there, there's an anger, there's a passion, a desire for an ecological future, a future. We've lost the capacity to create the future, a sense where the future would be different from today. And I think that all progressive thinking has always relied on having that image of the future. And I believe that the energy out there, the young, educated people coming through, is very much on a par with this way of thinking.
Thank you. Since as we look at least sources of rent, I mean, land is by far the biggest one by a giant share. How important is it, do you feel, that the reform of our relationship to land value and land rents is to your mission, to your vision?
Well, I think the land value tax should be regarded as essential, okay? I think it could be started at a modest level. We have to realize that in modern capitalism, which I call rentier capitalism, wealth has grown relative to income. The value of wealth has multiplied to many times the value of national income. And in the process, wealth inequality is much greater than income inequality. And we don't tax wealth. Only a tiny percentage of total tax comes from tax on wealth. Most of the tax comes from taxes on incomes. And I think that in that context, a land value tax, a wealth value tax, and the various forms of benefits people are getting from taking from the commons is an essential part. It's always been accepted by economists that it's far more efficient to tax wealth than it is to tax income. Yet our politicians have not put that fact into practice. And I think that's about time, especially as wealth has risen relative to income because of rentier capitalism, that we change that. And our politicians have got to be brave enough to advocate that. But they're frightened to death about proposing higher taxes. And they've got to find the narrative to change that. And that's why I think an eco-fiscal strategy is an essential approach.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it seems that, as you say, young people are starting to think about these things, be more open to them. And it seems a fundamental challenge we'd run into if we make progress here is young people versus current homeowners who would lose equity in a land value tax shift. So we've gone down that rabbit hole, almost gone full Georges to try and explain why we should need to have a land value tax in order to eventually have a basic income. But you get into these homeownership challenges that take you far away from basic income as a discussion point. And it just seems we need a multi-pronged, multifaceted strategy, and keep in mind where we're trying to go.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I see there are 95 comments in the chat, Floyd. I don't know how we're going to address them. I have to apologize in advance that we probably won't get to many of those comments if they're questions. But I'm happy to answer however many you want to throw at me.
Let's do it. So we have on slido.com, we've been posting the link. We have a number of questions there that people are voting on. So let's go into them in order. So the first one is from Logan saying, right now we already have a complex system of benefits and supports. How would you transition from our present policy to a basic income?
Well, first of all, I think we have to continue to expose the inequities and inefficiencies that are inbuilt in our social security, so-called system. We've gone down the road of means testing and behavior testing, because if you have means testing and you say only benefits for the poor, then you have immediately say, well, what if a person is supposedly lazy and poor because of their own fault? Then you have to introduce behavior testing to test whether they are actually looking for work and all that stuff. Then you have to introduce penalties. And at every stage, there is inequity built into it, punishment, stigma, and all the problems that go with poverty traps. Because if you try and get out of poverty, you lose benefits. So that's a disincentive. So it drives people to incur what I call immoral hazards, cheating, the state would say. We've got to dismantle the whole edifice of conditionality, targeting, and behavior testing. It does not work. It's hugely expensive, but it is grossly unfair. The people who are most vulnerable are least able to navigate those systems. You can show with numerous data that actually the people who lose out most are the most vulnerable and most in need. What sort of system is that? It's grossly unfair, inequitable, and regressive, and it divides society. It divides them into them and us. Us, good people, and them, scroungers, or whatever you want to call them. This is not the way to create a good society. So we need to dismantle the existing welfare systems and discredit it with anger, with contempt. And many countries have drifted into situations where they're cutting and cutting the amount of money for the most in need. Is that the way we would like to create a good society? Because then it leads to authoritarian controls, to penalizing, to criminalizing people unnecessarily. So for me, it's a matter of saying a basic income is an end goal, but it means dismantling a grotesque edifice of control systems that are administratively, demonstrably expensive, inequitable, and regressive, and do not create a good society.
Thank you. Very powerful words. Our next question would be, how far do you extend the commons? Locally, nationally, internationally? Do all people in the world have an equal rights to commons in Canada? I'm not sure the intent there, but how would you see that going?
Yeah, I think this is something I've discussed a lot in my books, in particular, The Blue Commons. And last year was a particularly interesting case, which actually concerns a Canadian multinational mining company. The incredible development came in 1982 with the passage of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Now, what UNCLOS did, it gave all nations with coastlines direct ownership of 200 nautical miles from their their shore. And it created an area outside the EEZs of the high seas and the area, as it's called. And they banned deep sea mining in the deep sea on condition that it should not be allowed to take place until there was an ecological code that would ensure the precautionary principle was respected in any mining that takes place, and that the benefits of any minerals from the sea would be shared equitably with all countries of the world, proportionately and equally. But there was a little clause, Article 82, which said that if a country and a corporation applied to start deep sea mining, the International Seabed Authority had precisely 2 years to draw up a code and a sharing mechanism. Otherwise, the mining company could go ahead. Well, in July 2021, the Canadian mining company applied through Nauru, the little island of Nauru, to start deep sea mining. And I was writing furiously saying this must be stopped because there is no sharing mechanism from the global commons. It's not in place. We haven't got a formula. It's not been agreed. And this mining company tried all sorts of tricks to get round the blockage. And I wrote a piece in the Financial Times, and I felt very proud of the fact that the chief executive of this huge multinational corporation, CMC, wrote an attack on me personally, personal insults in the Financial Times. I thought, wow, I've scored a point, because if he's woken up to have to attack me, it must have scored some points. And I'm pleased to say that there is a moratorium on it, but it could easily be got round it by these corporations without a sharing mechanism. Now, that's the global commons, right? You can work down to certain things that belong to a nation. So you should have a national eco tax or levy on taking from our seabed, on taking from our seashores, on taking from our land. But there are also certain things at local level. And those, I believe, should be put into a local fund or a supplement for a national fund and be used to help local areas and local investments. And I make a distinction between exhaustible commons, that is, commons that are being depleted and will not be replenished, like minerals, like oil, and replenishable commons, like a forest. And part of the money that's taken from putting a levy on the use of our forests should be used to replenish and regrow our forests. So 10% of what's the money, for example, and the rest should be put into the fund and build up for common dividends. So I think you have to look at the commons as a multifaceted amount of issues, of resources and things that we value, and approach it building a structure. But it's a structure built on justice and freedom, and therefore I think is feasible.
Absolutely.
Biodiversity is not replenishable. I see one comment. Some is and some isn't. Like we're seeing a rapid depletion of our fish populations. 34% of all our fish species are endangered right now. Now, they are replenishable if really effective conservation measures were taken, but they're not being. And at the moment, we need a global campaign to resurrect the marine commons.
It's very exciting to think that there's this new resource nobody's enclosed yet, the global blue commons. that could be a source of a global fund and a global UBI. That sounds like a good direction for some activists with an international view.
Well, I mean, I tell you, Floyd, the World Bank and the IMF, they reckon that if there's going to be an increase in economic growth in the world, it's going to come from blue growth. If you're going to get the green technological revolution on land, then the only ways for getting adequate amounts of minerals, for example, is from the sea. The cobalt, all the sorts of the copper and everything, the nickel, it's in the sea, not in the land. But the ecological damage that taking it with current technologies would be disgusting. And I think that we need to realize that there is no alternative other than reducing our need for these minerals, which means a sort of degrowth strategy, reducing our emphasis on GDP growth. GDP is a stupid measure of welfare. It gives a zero value to the most important form of work in the world, which is care. It gives a zero value to care work. So if you want to increase GDP, you reduce unpaid care work and you increase jobs, even if the jobs are useless. But that's what's happening. We need to reorient our way of thinking about different types of work. And then we will have a sense of what we want from growth. We should be wanting decoupling of resource uses from improvement in our well-being. And that's a very radical statement, but that's what we need.
And there is a degrowth movement, one of the leaders of which in Canada is in this meeting, Vlad Bunia. I'm sure if someone Googles Degrowth Canada, you'll find his group. So recommend them. Another question next voted high is, if we are to reclaim the commons from those who enclosed it illegitimately, how do we do so without the violence that has always accompanied real land reform?
Well, I think that's a fair question, but I think the realization that we need our commons is something that is very powerful among all classes. I give talks on the commons, and I notice that it's one of the subjects where the salariat, an elite, can identify with almost as much as the precariat. We want our commons. We value our parks. We value our forests. We value the land that we can enjoy. We value clean air. We value clean water and the beauties of nature and biodiversity. And I think it's something that today we realize that we're losing it at such a rapid rate that it is the existential crisis of our time, alongside insecurity and the risk of political extremism and the violence that is taking place and the genocide we're seeing in the Middle East. All of these things are interlinked. And I think that is why this dialogue, this way of looking at what we're experiencing, is a potentially fruitful approach which was ignored in the 20th century, both with state socialism and with pure capitalism of the Milton Friedman variety. They gave nature a zero value. You know, Hayek, the most influential of the neoliberals, he adopted the Austrian school of economics, which said that anything that has no price has no value. Well, therefore, it doesn't matter if you deplete your commons because it has no value. That's what they said. Now, this is a form of madness. It's a form of madness. But they were influential with Reagan, with Thatcher, and all of the Chicago school. And that is what we have to discredit. I see someone said that Friedman said least bad tax. Well, you know, that was because it's hardest to avoid. And that was his criterion of being least bad. But I think it's good. Thomas Paine would have said it's essential. So, you know, take your pick.
Can you contrast for us, this is based on the next question, is asking about, what about renationalizing rail, telecom, and hydro? Will that help or hinder? Can you contrast for us in your vision, where does nationalization of certain key industries like that have to separate itself or relate to a commons-based economy?
Well, I think we don't want to go back to old style nationalization, because we've learned that state bureaucrats can be pretty bad, and they can be inefficient and the rest of it. But it's not the case that we should have privatization of water or rail or many of the things that we did have nationalized. I believe in a sort of mutualized system where the governance of anything that belongs to the commons would require stewards. A steward historically has responsibility as a trustee to preserve the value of capital for future generations. But the mutualization means that all stakeholders in the ownership should have a role, not just capital, not just the state bureaucrats, but the users of a system, the workers in a system, should all have a role, and the surrounding communities should have a role. Once you remove the commoners from the governance, you get a depletion, a profiteering system, and a disregard for externalities, what we economists call externalities. And we need to make sure that the externalities are taken into account. You take aquaculture, for example. The big salmon farms only pay about 40 to 50% of production costs. The rest are borne by the surrounding commons. And that is not only unfair, but it leads to a neglect of the commons resources, a neglect of nature, and in the long term, a depletion of the resource base. So you've got to build in a system of governance which makes sure that every cost is borne by those who impose the costs, and that the revenue is shared with the commoners and plowed back to reproduce the resource base. But that's not what we got at the moment.
And that seems, for that to work, we would already need a form of commons capital funds, or else we'll be fighting the NIMBYs forever, not in my backyard people who just don't want anything to happen. I sometimes get challenged when I present these ideas. People are saying, well, wait, you want to compensate people for pollution? Then won't people want more pollution? And like, that's the reverse of the NIMBYs. Like, how do you deal with those types of comments?
Well, I think you can. Yeah, I was reading the comment about farming, fish farming underneath your beard at the moment, Floyd, and I was thinking that, if I may answer that question first, because it was saying that the aquaculture industry is claiming they're feeding the world. Well, what they're doing, incidentally, is destroying Atlantic salmon, for example, through aquaculture and through lice infestations and through not bearing the full costs and mass escapes that are destroying wild fish populations. The aquaculture industry is relying on fish meal. Vast factories are being built in developing countries to produce fish meal for export for pets and for feeding salmon and export prawns and so on, depleting the supply of small pelagic fish like sardines and mackerel and so on, which then affects larger fish and are depleting and stunting their growth. You cannot look at any of these things without thinking of ecosystems rather than individual species. And I think that goes with the commons as a way of looking at connected nature with life. And going back to Alexander von Humboldt, one of my heroes, intellectual heroes, who saw humans as merely one part of a whole cycle. And we have to be less hubristic and more grounded in how we appreciate the commons. So for me, it's a matter of being ecological and also a matter of justice.
Okay. Do you have any position on how indigeneity should impact ownership, beneficiary relationships to the commons and within the state and within the commons dividends vision?
Yeah, I do. It seems an off-the-wall question, but I have a section in my books on the commons on First Nations and indigenous people, and the importance of vernacular knowledge and vernacular learning. And there's a lovely saying about two-eyed seeing, that you shouldn't see things just through modern science, but also through vernacular science, common sense, if you like, built up by generations of people who've learned to survive and subsist inside their commons. And it's a matter of making sure that both systems are in sync. And again, this goes back to the commons as a perspective. And Canada has been a very interesting place for appreciating and learning about that. We know many, many mistakes and horrors of the past, but there are lessons from history that have come through, and it's the same in other parts of the world. And therefore, indigenization is part. I don't believe in pure anything. I think it's a matter of building a synergy.
What are your thoughts with recent advancements in artificial intelligence and its impact on the precariat?
Well, I've been, for my pains, and I'm not sure if I'll ever complete it, I've been commissioned to write a book on what I call the education commons. And I think the AI is something that is going to be incredibly disruptive, increase inequality, and increase rentier capitalism, because it increases the amount of private property rights in patents, in copyright, in the capacity of rent seeking through this new form of technology. It's a platform technology. It means it will affect the whole landscape of our production system. But it's also, I think, very worrying as part of the panopticon state. The panopticon state is something that we should be really concerned about. It's one of the secondary reasons for supporting a basic income, because you can withstand the panopticon to a greater extent if you have the guaranteed security of being able to say fuck off to figures in authority. And that's an important freedom. And AI, of course, has the capacity to control the way we think, to control the way we behave, and manipulate us politically, socially, and demographically. So I think it's a very scary development, but I don't think we're going to succeed in being King Canute, halting the waves. I think we have to, first of all, educate ourselves. Second, to develop the capacity to withstand the negative effects of increasing algorithm controls and so on. And at the moment, the precariat is the primary victim of the panopticon state. And our politicians are giving it scant attention. But this has gone quite away from the idea of common dividends. But it is important, I think, to see the algorithms and the AI and the panopticon state as limiting our freedom. And we should have an agenda that is emancipatory, that is genuinely geared to giving us a sense of personal freedom and social solidarity. And that is why basic income is such an important element in the future progressive politics.
Absolutely. And my own journey with all this as a former software engineer began with the question, how do we share in this technological progress? How do we make sure everyone benefits? And my own research came, which inspired by you, came to the view that economic rents is what shared human common property should be. And that is how you quantify technological progress, and that is what should be shared. And that's become a big mission for us.
But I think the intellectual property rights system is one of the biggest problems we face in the global economy, because the number of patents has multiplied dramatically in recent years. And don't forget that every single patent gives the owner of the patent a guaranteed monopoly profit stretching for 20 years or even 40 years in certain sectors. And many of the patents are the result of commons research, public research, subsidized by us, yet it goes to private individuals. And I think that this is fundamentally a stealing from our commons. Thomas Jefferson famously said, you know, making ideas private property makes no sense. Ideas belong to all of us. Your ideas, my ideas, are built on the ideas of many people before us. Can you say that it's all yours? You can't. I can't. So I think that we should see ideas as part of our commons.
So I'll ask one more question, and then you can give final comments. Thank you everyone for staying. Many of us are almost 2 hours into the call. Shows our passion.
I'm looking forward to a good drink afterwards.
Yeah, I wish I was there to have one with you. So a question is, what historical society would you seek to emulate in relation to setting up common ownership and common stewardship?
Well, that's a lovely question on which to end. I have written this book, Politics of Time, and I've written the final chapter as an allegorical chapter. And it was inspired in a sense by William Morris, who wrote a wonderful book called News from Nowhere in 1896, 98, I forget exactly, 98. And essentially he said that if others can see it as I have seen it, then it's not a dream, it's a vision. And what I've tried to do in that final chapter is I've drawn elements of what I think would make a good society and imagined it coming into existence and how it could come into existence. And it is oriented to really reinventing for the 21st century the idea of commoning as a verb. Commoning throughout our history has been something where people have shared activities, where the activities of reproduction and sharing have been as important as production. And I think we can create such a society, and it draws from elements that you still see in Africa. I've just come back from East Africa, where the sense of Ubuntu is still strong. So there are elements out there. The country that seems to be picking up my ideas more than anywhere else is South Korea. And they have a lovely concept in South Korea of Hongik Ingan, shared activity to produce individuality. And it goes right the way back to the foundation of Korea in BC 3334, incredible length of time that it's been in existence. And that element was destroyed by the Japanese occupation, but not eradicated. And that spirit is very much there. So I was asked to speak to the Korean parliament in Seoul, and they got it. They could teach me. I mean, you know, they understood it. So you see elements there around the world, and I think people are listening and talking about these things to a much greater extent. And there'll be someone listening now, I don't know who will take the ideas forward. And before you're retired, Floyd, they'll be introducing it somewhere in Canada. And that's great. That's where we should be. So I hope I can end on that point, because I think it's a suitable end, saying, let's not lose our sense of romantic idealism. Let's think we can create a good society. Let's do it.
Thank you so much. This is the inspiration I needed. And for those of you in the audience, continue following UBI Works for basic income advocacy, and the Commons discussion will continue at Commonwealth Canada. And hopefully, Mr. Stanning, will have you again maybe a year from now to talk about our progress.
Or even see you in Canada. Okay,
yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.